Oki, Nidanagu, Apoyaki. My name is Dr. Tiffany Preet. I'm a member of the Blood Tribe, which is part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. I'm also an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Alberta. I'm also an intergenerational survivor of the residential school system in Canada. The first time I learned about residential schools, I was in my early elementary years. During library time, I had found a nonfiction book in my school library that was written about my people, who are the Bloods. In the book, there was a chapter on residential schools. I had never heard this term before. When I came home from school, the first thing I said to my mother was, "Why didn't you ever tell me that you went to residential school?" My mom seemed horrified by my question. She wanted to know who had told me about residential schools. The book portrayed residential schools as though they were these wonderful and magnificent institutions for Indigenous children to grow up in. I would come to learn that these types of schools were actually quite horrific to grow up in. But no one really talked about residential schools. It wasn't really a topic that people were very open about. So whenever someone did talk about residential schools, you paid attention and you listened very carefully. Some people would give bits and pieces about the abuse they suffered at the school, while others talked about what it was like living at the school and how much they missed their parents. But the stories that were shared were never very explicit, and it was the type of topic that you were never really encouraged to talk about. I found as a child, when I would get together with other children my age or with my relatives, sometimes our conversations would turn to residential schools, and we would share what we had heard our relatives say. And together, we would try and piece together what had happened to our parents, our grandparents, our relatives, and to our people in these institutions. And because of the way that your family members talked about residential schools, you would pick up on how it was the kind of topic that you didn't really ask questions about. It was only if someone wanted to share with you their personal experiences. So having never attended a residential school, I have some idea of what happened in these institutions and what it was like to grow up in such a school. But really, I can't say that I know what it was like. I don't know if a person can really say that they truly understand what it was like unless they actually lived through it. It was knowing that something significant happened in your people's history to the point that you knew something was affecting your family members, even if they didn't talk about it. But it was not having the words as a child to articulate what was going on and what it was that you were feeling and how it affected yourself, but knowing that it was everywhere. You would try to make sense of what was going on and try your best to deal with it and to cope with what was going on around you. It made it even harder knowing that while you were trying to deal with this, you got treated differently by the rest of Canada, but not understanding why you got treated differently. Now, as an adult, looking back, I would describe it as watching the generation before you reacting to the trauma that they experienced at residential schools and the trauma of being colonized, and then having that generation raise you. There are certain implications that come with that. Growing up, it made it particularly hard going to school with non-Indigenous people when they would give you a hard time about being Indigenous, and the misinformation that gets spread around about being status Indigenous or treaty Indigenous. It was hard being constantly bombarded with the message of just get over it. I really struggled with the idea of just getting over it. How do you get over something that seemed like it was everywhere, and yet you really didn't understand what it was, and yet you were expected to just get over it? I eventually grew up to get my PhD. I have my Doctor of Philosophy in Indigenous Peoples Education. There are certain challenges associated with being an Indigenous person and obtaining a PhD, which is a completely different discussion, but still related to this narrative. Part of my role as Dr. Preet is that I get to conduct research. One of my prerogatives in obtaining my PhD has been that I could conduct research that could potentially impact my people in positive ways. Every research study I design is written specifically with my people in mind so that they can potentially benefit from the conclusions and recommendations that are drawn from the results in the study. I designed a research study called We Are Niitsitapi, Surviving Colonization. And in Blackfoot, Niitsitapi means the real people, where I wanted to conduct an archival and oral history research study to explore, reveal, and record significant aspects of the residential school history on the Blood Reserve. I'm so thankful for the financial contributions of the National Indian Brotherhood who funded this research project. Without their financial support, this research study would not have been possible. I also want to thank my chief and counsel for supporting me in this research endeavor and granting me permission to conduct this project. For the past year, I got to embark upon an amazing journey that brought me across Canada to learn about the history of the Indian residential school system on my home reserve. It is a journey that I wish every member of my tribe could take, and every Indigenous person who has been affected by the residential school system. I found myself in places that I never thought I would ever travel to in order to learn about my people's history, like Quebec. I never thought I would have to travel to Quebec to learn about my people's history. I was skeptical when I learned that there were archives that I would want to visit that are outside of my people's traditional territory. But each archive that I have visited has been very valuable to me in my quest to learn about what happened to my people during the residential school era. I want to thank the archives and their respective archivists who participated in this project, who are the Galt Museum, the Glenbow Museum, the Anglican Diocese of Calgary Archives, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Calgary Archives, the Provincial Archives of Alberta, Library and Archives Canada, the United Church of Canada Archives, the General Synod Archives, and the Grey Nuns of Nicolet Archives. The best analogy I can give of what it has been like to complete this research study is that it has been a lot like putting a puzzle together, without having some kind of guide to help me put the puzzle pieces together. It is as though someone took my people's history with residential schools, broke it into pieces, and scattered these pieces all over Canada. And I've been traveling across Canada trying to find these pieces to put the puzzle back together, to make sense of what happened, but also to try and understand what happened as well, which is a challenging task when you don't have all of the puzzle pieces. When I started off, I had some idea of where I wanted to go and which archives I wanted to visit, but I didn't realize just how much information there would be and how much information I would have to sift through to find what I was looking for. It was like I would put 8 hours in one day in the archives, I would be able to put together a small section of the puzzle, and I would think that I understood what those puzzle pieces meant. But the next day, I would spend another 8 hours in the archives, and I would be able to add onto those previously assembled puzzle pieces, and my understanding of the subject would increase. I've learned through this study that I've had a lot of misconceptions. I believed that I would be able to find almost everything about my people without leaving Alberta, since that is where the majority of our territory resides, which turned out to be a false assumption. I ended up visiting 4 archives outside of Alberta in order to continue my learning of my people's history. And now, a year into my research study, I feel like I've been able to make a considerable dent in putting the puzzle pieces back together. But I know I don't have everything, and that drives me a little crazy, because I want to be as thorough as possible. So the knowledge that comes out of my research is what I know so far. I feel like I have a pretty good sense of the timelines, but I know that there is more information out there that I could collect, and that could help me finish putting the puzzle pieces back together. I just haven't figured out where all the puzzle pieces have ended up so that I can visit those archives as well. Another misconception I had, and that I think a lot of Canadians have as well, is that we call it the residential school era. There seems to be this exclusive focus on residential schools, when in fact, there were many other types of schools that were used to educate Indigenous children. Residential schools were just one of the types of schools that were used. And yes, it was this school type that was used the longest in First Nations communities. But we are missing out on the conversations that the government had with the other school models that were used before they settled on the exclusive use of residential schools on reserve for many, many years. I feel like it is very beneficial to learn about those other school models what they were, and how the government moved from those models to the residential school model, to other models, and to what is currently being used today in Indigenous education. So when people talk about the residential school era, I don't know if they're talking specifically about just the residential schools, or are they using it as a term to denote the entire history of Indigenous education since colonization. And so far in this video, I've been using that language of residential schools to mean the entire history of Indigenous education since colonization, because I know that it is what people are most familiar with. But I feel like we need to change our language around those topics to be specific and be intentional with our meaning. Are we talking only about residential schools, or are we talking about the entire colonized form of education that has been imposed upon Indigenous children? Should we be using a different term that denotes this era of Indigenous education since colonization, like the stolen children era? Previously, I mentioned that I didn't realize just how much information there is out there, mostly because I had this limited scope of what my research would entail. When I learned about these other educational models, I wanted to learn about them and include them in my research study. I ended up reading a century's worth of history from each of the religions that had schools on the Blood Reserve, which has been a lot of work and a challenge being able to put together a timeline for each of these religions that spans a century, and for some of them, longer than a century. I was surprised to learn that we had another religion on our reserve that opened schools, apart from the Anglican and Roman Catholic schools that I had already known about. This is amongst many other details about my people's history that I didn't know, and that I'm really excited to be able to share this knowledge with others. In these archives I visited, I collected primary and secondary documents written about the education system on my reserve. I studied the policies that the Canadian government enacted, and then how the government officials and religions who ran these denominational schools implemented these policies. What I learned was that the government would make these policies, and to a certain degree, it was up to the discretion of the principal to interpret the policies and how they were going to enforce them in their schools. There was a system of checks and balances to make sure that these policies were being properly enforced. I learned what type of disciplinary measures were taken for those individuals who were not performing to the standards that the government would like them to. Through the study, I've been able to learn a lot about the history of the education system on my reserve since being colonized, but I was missing something. I want to go back to my puzzle piece analogy. After visiting 9 archives, it is like I have all of these clusters of puzzle pieces that I've figured out, but are still disconnected from one another. In order to help me make sense of what I've been able to solve and how these pieces interrelate to one another, the last part of my research study has consisted of conducting talking circles with elders from my reserve. What was missing from reviewing these historical documents was a human experience. It wouldn't matter how long or how much I studied these policies. These documents cannot attest to what it was like to actually live through these policies that I have been studying. I invited several elders from my reserve to go through some of these policies with me, to learn what their thoughts were on these policies, how they affected themselves and their families, and to share with me their experiences of living through this era. I could have never gotten the knowledge that has come out of these talking circles by just studying the primary and secondary documents from these archives. My elders' time and knowledge has been invaluable to me, and I'm so thankful for their willingness to participate and to share with me their thoughts and experiences with these policies. I most especially want to give a heartfelt thanks to my elders who participated in this project, who are Beverly Hungry Wolf, Delphine Goodstriker, Leroy Heavy Runner, Georgette Fox, and Jeffrey Bullshields. I especially want to thank Beverly, who is my mentor elder for this project. She was there to advise me and make sure that I was completing my research in a culturally appropriate way. I loved every second of working with my elders. They all agreed to be audio and video recorded, and I'll be putting together videos of the sessions that we did together to share with our people so that they can learn about these policies and the elders' experiences with living with these policies. My elders were so kind-hearted, had such love and respect for one another, and they were all really funny. Their stories really helped give a context for the policies that I had learned about. For example, in the late 1950s, the government changed their policies on home visits. For the first time, children were allowed to go home on the weekends and visit their families. That was the policy, but again, it was up to the discretion of the principal and how they would implement such a policy. I assumed that children would get to go home every weekend because the government hadn't clearly outlined what visiting the home would look like. I learned that students didn't get to go home every weekend. They got to go home once a month, and between arbitrary hours that the principal decided upon. At a certain time on Friday afternoons, children could go home, but if the parents were 1 minute late picking their child up, the family would be punished, and the child could not go home. They also had to have their child back by a certain time as well, and if their families were late returning the child would not be eligible to go home the next time there was a weekend visit. There's no amount of studying the primary and secondary documents from these archives that could have told me how the schools implemented such a policy. I'm very thankful to my elders, and I've learned so much from them. I want to share with you a few of the observations that were quite evident and prevalent in each of the talking circles. Despite the Canadian government's best attempts at assimilating Indigenous peoples into mainstream society, my elders illustrated to me time and time again that as Indigenous peoples, we are resilient, how we have not been assimilated, that after over a century of abuse at the hands of these policies, that our Niitsitapi way of life is still strong, and the elders emulated and lived our Niitsitapi values, which are reciprocity, interconnectedness, kindness, generosity, respect, balance, harmony, sharing, and giving. As well, I observed how much our elders love us and that they pray for us and are mindful of us and our futures, that they are looking for ways to help us through our intergenerational trauma. I am thankful for the presence and role that our elders play in our Niitsitapi way of life. While primarily my research journey has been one of learning my people's history with the residential schools and the education system that was forced upon Indigenous peoples since colonization, it has also been a journey of healing for me. I never went to residential school. I am part of the first generation of Indigenous peoples who were never subjected to such a school, but I am still dealing with the effects of residential school. Growing up, I had people tell me that I didn't need to heal from residential schools because I never grew up in one, and so its negative effects hadn't touched me and hadn't become a part of me. Those people are wrong. It does affect me. It has touched me. And not until I conducted this research study have I begun to understand just how deeply and profoundly I have been influenced and touched by the Canadian government and those religions who tried to assimilate us through these educational policies. I can now see how their policies and how the negative effects of residential schools has seeped even into the lives of my children. In a previous research study I conducted on how effective the Alberta Education's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit policy framework is at creating positive perceptions of Indigenous peoples and increasing student understanding of the 7 learning objectives that are outlined in the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit policy framework. I used a mixed method research design using surveys and interviews to do so. One of the findings to come out of the study was learning that students lacked an understanding of the consequences and effects that colonization has had and continues to have on the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Students believed that what has happened in the past stayed in the past and had no bearing on the present and future circumstances. This assumption is completely false and something that needs to be addressed in our present school system. My current research study, We Are Niitsitapi, Surviving Colonization, illustrates very much how these past educational policies are still affecting Indigenous peoples today. This research study also provided me with a unique opportunity to bond with my mother over my project. My mother is a residential school survivor, and she rarely talks about her time in these schools. I can't even begin to describe how difficult it has been growing up knowing that something happened to your parent in one of these schools, but not knowing what exactly happened, and the hurt that you feel for them. I never wanted to pressure my mom into sharing with me what happened to her. And I've waited, thinking maybe one day my mother would share with me these details. I had an opportunity to visit the University of British Columbia's Residential School History and Dialogue Center last year. It's a center dedicated to healing from the trauma of residential schools and a place where survivors, intergenerational survivors, and the public can come to learn about and research the residential school system in Canada. I wish we had a center like this in each province and territory in Canada. As I went through the center, one of the exhibits talked about how we can respectfully talk about residential schools. One thing that was pointed out was reasons why some of the survivors may not like to talk about their experiences. I always assumed that my mother never talked about her experiences at residential school because it was too painful for her. It had never occurred to me that she may not want to share with her children because she doesn't want us to know what happened to her. In conducting this research study, I have come to accept that it is highly probable that I may never know what happened to my mother in residential school. But this research study allowed me an opportunity to talk with my mother about residential schools in a way that I've never been able to do before. While we never talked about those intimate details of what happened to her, we were able to talk about some of the smaller, inconsequential details, and it has been a big deal for me. I never thought I would ever say in my life that I have been able to bond with my mother over residential schools. While this research has been very fascinating for me to study, it has also been very taxing on me mentally and emotionally, as I've read the policies and read how my people were treated, and what the Canadian government, their officials, and the religions thought of my people. Despite that, I feel very blessed to have been able to do this work, and for the support I've received from the National Indian Brotherhood, my Chief and Council, my Dean and Departmental Chair at the University of Alberta, my elders, the archives who participated in this research, and my people who have rallied beside me while I've completed this work. I look forward to being able to disseminate this work to my people, helping teachers learn how to teach about residential schools in their classrooms, and finding ways of engaging the public and learning the truth of what has happened to the Indigenous peoples of Canada through the imposed colonialistic educational system. Thank you.